Long days and pleasant nights from the rolling green hills of Ireland, Cad Mela Falsha, 100,000 welcomes. Thank you for joining me in this video, and today we're going to talk about the American who helped sink the Bismarck, Leonard B. Smith. So this story begins when the Bismarck was launched by Nazi Germany in World War II in a way to compete with the Royal Navy in the Atlantic Ocean, and in some way to punch back against the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy has always been well known to rule the seas, and that whole Britannia rule the waves, that this was a way for Nazi Germany to have some punching power against the Royal Navy. And just to paint the picture on the way the world was at, what the world was like at this moment in time, was that Nazi Germany invaded Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, France, Greece. All these countries in Europe had been completely murked by Germany, and Europe was basically being controlled by Nazi Germany, and all these puppet states were being controlled through the goals and aims of Adolf Hitler. And this is where the Americans come into play, and America always has some sort of way to help So Leonard B. Smith is a very interesting character, and he would be the first man in American history to be involved in a naval victory in World War II. And I don't understand why there isn't documentaries and films and song about this guy, because I found it very, very hard to find information about this man. And I had to research in all these different websites. I struggled to find any information about this guy, and you would think that this man who helped sink the Bismarck, there would be much more information on him, but it's very, very hard. So if you do have any more information on Leonard B. Smith, please let me know in the comments. But we're going to get into, I've done weeks of research into this, so I'm just going to tell you what I've discovered. And Leonard B. Smith flew out of Ireland to sink the Bismarck, to help sink the Bismarck. And if it wasn't for Leonard Smith, the Bismarck would have been able to return to Germany and to prey on the merchant navy and to cause havoc in the Atlantic Ocean. So if it wasn't for Leonard B. Smith, this ship wouldn't have sank, and the Bismarck is possibly one of the most famous ships of all of World War II, and it's famous for its failure, but also famous for the way it ended, and famous for the sinking of HMS Hood. And we're going to get into that story, but before we start on this story, there has been a delay in getting this video uploaded, and the reason why is that there was a sudden death in the family, and it came very suddenly, and it shook up the family. It was very sudden, came out of the blue, came out of nowhere, and she was old, and it was a very sad time, and this is why there has been this is why there was a delay in the video. So apologies in that, and thank you for your sympathies, thank you for your prayers. We do know that she's with the good Lord, and we're just still coming to terms with what happened. But thank you so much for watching this video and understanding the circumstances. But let's get into the full story about Leonard B. Smith, who sank the Bismarck flying out of Ireland in Loch Erne in 1941. Just to paint the picture, in 1941, Germany had murked all of Europe, had been completely decimating Europe, and all these countries would fall under Nazi occupation. You were being occupied by a fascist state, and if you were resisting, you were thrown into a camp. If you decided to fight against this, you were considered an enemy of the state, and you would be exterminated by the Gestapo. You would be in a concentration camp. So you had to capitulate, and this was the state of Europe at the time. And without America in World War II, Europe would have fell. Europe would have collapsed, especially Britain. The United Kingdom was in this fight alone, and many countries who were in exile, they did flee to Britain, and this is where America would begin the Lend Lease Act. And the Lend Lease Act would start from the 11th of March 1941, and it would end in September in 1945. And the Lend Lease Act was basically, picture this: if your neighbour's house is on fire, and you lend them a garden hose to put out the fire, that is what Lend Lease is like. And I'm sure you've heard this before, because this is what Franklin D. Roosevelt said, that he said that if your neighbour's house was on fire, this is like lending them a garden hose to help fight the fire. And this is the way America viewed the Lend Lease Act, that this was a way to assist in the security of America, because America had trade with all these nations worldwide, and now it was being affected by Nazi Germany. And the Lend Lease Act was to send merchant ships, and it would be billions and billions of dollars would be sent to all these nations. It would be food, clothing, farming equipment, and military equipment. Be tanks, firearms, ammunition, fuel, oil, gas, tanks, and also planes. And this is where Leonard B. Smith would come into play, that Can you imagine your country is neutral during the war, your country is not at war yet, and you decide to volunteer to go and help fight against the Nazi regime? And this is where many volunteers would enlist and go and help, and America sort of kept this secret because America didn't want Germany to see that they were picking sides because they were neutral. So America sort of allowed their citizens to volunteer. You can go and volunteer for the Germans if you want, but very few people did go and volunteer for Germany, but many families did go and fight for Germany, who had family relations, family generations, who had connection to Germany, but the majority did go and fight for the Allies. And America viewed these allies as their own security, that Britain was in a dire situation, that Nazi Germany were sinking all these boats. See all these boats that were coming in? They were being sunk by the German U-boats. These submarines were laying waste to thousands and thousands of tons being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So all these goods were being sunk, and Britain, being such a strong heavy navy, that the Royal Navy was starting to escort and protect these merchants. These merchant ships were starting to be protected by destroyers, and these destroyers would detect U-boats and scan the oceans for the German U-boats to try and prevent these ships from being sunk. And this is where the Bismarck would come into play, that Nazi Germany's view on this was to build a huge battleship to try and compete with the Royal Navy if it comes to blow, if this comes to a fight, that at least Germany will have a way to punch back at the Royal Navy. When the Bismarck was built, that he was built, and yes, Indy Nadell will also say the Bismarck was laid down as a he, that the Bismarck was named after Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor who united Germany, or the Prussia. And I can't get into a big video on the dimensions of the Bismarck, but the Bismarck was easily the largest ship in Europe at the time. 50,000 tons and 8 15-inch guns. 8 or 15 or 16-inch guns. And it would have the state-of-the-art radar and anti-aircraft capabilities. It was an absolute terror of the seas, and Britain knew that this ship was going to present problems, especially against merchants. That these ships that were coming in through the Lend Lease Act, and as I said, the Lend Lease Act was signed on March 1941, and the Bismarck would go out into the Atlantic Ocean to raid on these boats in May 1941. So this was a couple of months after the Lend Lease Act was signed, and Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany realised that America was going to present a huge problem to their war effort, because all this merchandise, all this goods and equipment was being shipped in on a massive scale to Britain and other countries too. It was helping France, it was helping Russia, it was helping China, it was helping many other nations were being helped by America. So this is something that we're very grateful for, that if it wasn't for America, the war would have been lost. Leonard Smith, the pilot who would be crucial in this story, the American pilot, he would be sent to Ireland, in the north of Ireland, in a loch called Loch Erne. And loch just means lake in Gaelic or in Irish. That this big loch, this huge, big, beautiful lake nestled in the county Fermanagh, this would be the launching site of the Catalina boats, the Catalina flying boats, that these crucial planes that were going to be used as reconnaissance, they were going to be used as a way to patrol the seas for submarines, and they had a huge range, they had lots of fuel, and these Catalina boats were built by America. They were actually built in Canada, but they were licensed by an American company. And these Catalina boats, hundreds and hundreds of them, were sold or lent to Britain, and they were lent to many other nations, but mostly Britain. And Leonard Smith was a pilot of one of these Catalina boats, and he volunteered to go over to Britain and join the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, and to get the pilots familiar with this plane, get them to know how it operates, the way it turns, the way it takes off, the way it lands, the way the fuel operates, everything inside out, that teach these RAF pilots the way these planes operate. And he would be a part of a squadron that was based in Loch Erne. And Loch Erne, I'll show you videos here, beautiful, beautiful location. So can you imagine being an American? He was born, as I said before, there's very little information on this guy, this amazing Chad, that there's so little information on this man. And this man, the first guy to be involved in a naval victory in World War II. There should be films made about this guy, that he is going to be so important in this story, that he was in Loch Erne and he was born in Missouri. He was born in Missouri and he came over around about 20 years of age. I can't imagine doing something like this in my 20s. That born in Missouri, and he qualified from the Naval Academy in Illinois, and he came over to help the RAF. And even Franklin D. Roosevelt said if Nazi Germany did realize that the Americans were involved in this sinking of the Bismarck, Germany would have attacked New York or Florida, somewhere like that. So this was kept hush hush. Even people in Congress were not aware of these American pilots that were going over to Britain to help the war effort. But Franklin D. Roosevelt said, if they had have known, I would have been impeached. But Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that Nazi Germany was a security threat, a threat to American security, because all American trade is being affected here. All of the world trade is being affected by this war. So America knew that they need to do something, and they need to help. Leonard B. Smith would get a phone call from the headquarters in England saying that there is a ship in the Atlantic Ocean. This was May 1941. He would get a phone call saying that there is a ship in the Atlantic Ocean at the moment called the Bismarck, and it is the largest battleship that Nazi Germany have, and could you patrol the ocean and just to check to make sure that this ship is not causing havoc around the shores. And I'm just going to talk about the operation, what the Bismarck was actually doing that day in May 1941. So the Bismarck, the plan for the Bismarck was to sail from Germany, secretly pass through the British blockade, and to make his way into the Atlantic Ocean and to prey on all the merchant navy and sink as much ships as possible. And this mission would be a very, very dangerous and bold risk. That this was a risk that Germany were willing to take. And the Bismarck, being 50,000 tons and 2,000 men on board, 8 15-inch guns, huge, massive ship, would make its way into the Atlantic Ocean, and it would link up with another ship called the Prinz Eugen. And the Prinz Eugen was a heavy cruiser, and a cruiser is basically, if you consider a battleship like a heavyweight boxer, a cruiser or a heavy cruiser would be like a light heavyweight, someone who is a bit faster, a bit sharper, a bit quicker, but doesn't pack as much punch as a heavyweight. So that's the best way I can put an allegory on these ships, on these classes. But the battleship would link up with Prinz Eugen, and they would make their way into the Atlantic Ocean. As the Bismarck was making its way through Denmark and through the gap, that it was spotted by the Swedes. The Swiss would spot the Bismarck and a flotilla coming through the gap, and the Swedes would radio in to the British that they seen huge ships sailing into the ocean. And this is where the British got word that this was the Bismarck, that the Bismarck is making its way into the Atlantic Ocean. And this is when they knew that something was very, very strange, that they can't let this happen. They cannot let the Bismarck just make its way into the Atlantic Ocean without a fight, without this. This is going to cause serious problems. So the Bismarck made its way up to Norway, where it would link up with Prinz Eugen, and this is where the ships Norfolk and Suffolk would begin tracking and begin to track the Bismarck and stay back, because the Suffolk and the Norfolk didn't have the punching power to even compete with the Bismarck. The Bismarck would destroy these ships, but Winston Churchill gave orders that the Norfolk and the Suffolk should track and stalk the ships as they made their way through in the Atlantic Ocean. And this is when the British would release HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. The Hood was the pearl or the jewel of the Royal Navy. This was the biggest ship for 20 years in the Royal Navy. And now HMS Hood had met its match, that the Bismarck was able to fight HMS Hood and the HMS Prince of Wales by itself. This is how big the Bismarck was. And I can just show you some of the images here of Hood, that this was a very capable ship, but it lacked in armour capabilities. Its armour wasn't as good as the Bismarck. You see, the Treaty of Versailles, this treaty was meant to tie one hand behind the back of Germany. That this treaty was meant to neuter Germany in the war effort, but it didn't. This treaty somewhat caused the Allies to be blind, that they believed that Germany would live up to this Treaty of Versailles, but in secret Hitler was building a huge army and a navy and an air force to stab the Allies in the back and to completely take over Europe by deceiving the Americans and the League of Nations that they were going to follow the rules, but really Hitler was breaking the rules, and this is why the Bismarck was way over the Treaty of Versailles limit. So this is one of the reasons why the Bismarck was made so big, because it was to try and get ahead of all the rest of the other nations that were a bit behind. On the 24th of May at 5 o'clock in the morning, HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales made their presence, and they began to sail up to firing range of the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen. And HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales believed that the Bismarck was ahead of the Prinz Eugen, and both ships fired on the Prinz Eugen, believing that it was actually the Bismarck. And this is where the first mistake would occur, that all this firing and precision was aimed at the wrong ship. And this is when the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen were able to fire all their guns at the same time, because HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales were only able to fire their front guns as they were sailing directly towards these ships, and the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen were able to fire full broadsides. During these salvos at 5 o'clock in the morning on May the 24th, early hours of the morning, this is where the Prince of Wales would get struck somewhere around the midship and begin a fire, and this is when HMS Hood would also be hit, and some damage was also done to the Bismarck, where the Bismarck began to leak some oil round about or aft of the ship, or at the back of the ship some oil would begin leaking out, and the damage was very minor. But this is where Leonard B. Smith, the American pilot, this is where he would come into play, that this oil leak would be something that is going to be the downfall of the Bismarck. So in the early hours of the morning, May the 24th, when these shots were being exchanged between Prince of Wales and Hood and the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen, a shot believed to be from the Bismarck would be fired, and one shot would land directly onto the deck of HMS Hood and absolutely decimate the ship. The pride of the Royal Navy, the mighty battlecruiser Hood, would be sunk, and the ship would be blown in two, absolutely crippled. Her back would snap in half. And I've got something written down here from a sailor on board of HMS Hood, and out of all the sailors, only 3 survivors would be from the HMS Hood. And this is a bit of writing I've got here from a sailor on HMS Hood called Ted Briggs, and I quote, "I personally didn't hear any explosion at all. We were all thrown off our feet, and all I saw was a gigantic sheet of flame and the sound of the ship ripping apart. There was no order to abandon ship. It wasn't necessary." So that's from Ted Briggs, that he said he actually didn't even hear an explosion. And it's the same when a boxer gets knocked out. If you hear interviews about fighters who are knocked out, they say that they didn't even feel anything. So this is something that is probably similar to a ship when it's knocked out like that, that it's just so quick and violent that you don't even feel anything. and brigs would go on to survive. HMS Prince of Wales, who was basically by herself at this point, she fired another salvo. She fired all her guns at the Bismarck, but the Bismarck would also exchange back in a volley of shots, and some of these shots would land on the Prince of Wales and cause major damage. And this is where the Prince of Wales began to back out from this fight. I've got a quote here, another quote written down from another sailor from HMS Prince of Wales called John Gaynor. And he was on the Prince of Wales, and this is what he said. As I was looking at the Bismarck, I saw all these winking lights, and I thought, oh, isn't that pretty? And then all of a sudden I realised what I thought was pretty was death and destruction in the form of about 8 tons of metal coming my way. Just think about that. When the Bismarck fired all its guns, it weighed 8 tons, all its shells, 8 tons of ammunition was coming the Prince of Wales's way, and the Prince of Wales would be struck in the conning tower, or the main centre of the ship. So we'll have testimony here from a sailor called Richard Osborne, who was on board the Prince of Wales, and he would say, and I quote, "We had about 16-inch shells go through the main bridge and exploded as it was making its way out, and killed an awful lot up there. But me being 16 and in my keenness, I ran up to help and tidy up the bridge and to help who was ever there. And when I went in, all I could see was not people, but bits of people." Like, that is the most horrifying thing you could ever imagine. So he ran into the captain's bridge, and instead of seeing a bunch of people standing there, he just seen bits of people. Just bits of human, bits of bone and skin, just completely decimated by these huge shells. And this must have been absolutely terrifying. Pure horror. Just a phenomenal testimony there from some of these sailors. With the Prince of Wales being out of action and being too damaged, the Prince of Wales decided to withdraw from the fight and to back off and to join with Suffolk and Norfolk a bit more behind the Bismarck. But the Bismarck, having sustained damage itself, Bismarck decided to make its way back to France to try and get repairs and to lick up her wounds to go back on another mission. But this is when Winston Churchill would get the call. So when the Naval Command got word and information that the HMS Hood, the mighty battlecruiser Hood, had been sunk by the Bismarck, this is when the Naval Office phoned Winston Churchill and to say, "Churchill, we just lost HMS Hood and the Bismarck sank her, and yeah, so we basically lost the biggest ship that we have in our navy." And Winston Churchill was like, "What? We just lost Hood? Like, sank? Like she's gone? Like she's not damaged, or she's not in critical condition, but she's actually sank?" And Naval Command said yes, and we've only got 3 survivors. There's only 3 survived. Winston Churchill could not believe it. And Winston Churchill said, "Send everybody. Send every single ship in the vicinity, every single ship possible, into the area where the Bismarck is." And the Naval Command said, "Right, okay, we'll do that. We'll try our best." And the Navy said, "Do you mean everybody? Like, everyone?" And Churchill,
Bring me everyone. What do you mean everyone?
British had an aircraft carrier nearby called HMS Victorious. And Victorious had actually been doing exercises at the time. Pilots were being trained and they were very, very new. They were completely new to the aircraft carrier. So lots of these men weren't even qualified to go on an attack yet. So with Winston Churchill saying every ship to go to that area, because it was such short notice, many of the ships weren't actually prepared for an engagement at this scale. Some ships were actually under-fueled as well and underarmed, but HMS Victorious, many of the pilots weren't actually ready yet, and there was another ship called Repulse and King George V, and these ships weren't actually, their guns weren't zeroed in, they weren't completely ready. And what zeroed in basically means is that these guns needed to be sighted properly and to be calibrated to rangefinders, and these rangefinders would have to be synced up. They would have to be completely in synchronization, and if they weren't synchronized, shots would miss. So a bunch of these ships had came to the area to try and find the Bismarck, to make sure that this ship was not going to make it home. This aircraft carrier, being inexperienced pilots on board, they still decided to attack because this was the orders from Churchill: send everybody you have. And these pilots would take off, setting sail to the coordinates that was issued to them, and they would be scanning the waters to try and find this big huge ship. And these boats would be swordfish boats, and as I said, they were just training previously, so they weren't actually properly experienced yet. But the pilots on board flying did spot the Bismarck, and they decided to attack. And all these planes started to fly in with their torpedoes, and they launched, and every single torpedo missed except for one, which would strike the Bismarck in the midship or right in the middle. But the Bismarck, being so heavily armoured, 320 millimeters of armour, the torpedo didn't even do any damage really. It just made a slight dent in the armour. But the pilots did successfully attack and return to HMS Victorious. And this is where the pilots would tell their commander that they did see the Bismarck, and the Bismarck returned fire with all its anti-aircraft gunfire, but none of the planes were lost. But this is where the rest of the Royal Navy were aware that the Bismarck was in a defensive mode, that it was alone, because Prinz Eugen, what the Royal Navy didn't know was that the Prinz Eugen had sailed by itself, and it was going to make its own way, as the Bismarck caused a slight distraction to the Royal Navy by firing its guns. So Prinz Eugen had actually made its way back to France, slipping away, but the Bismarck, not being damaged by this torpedo attack, was still able to make, the Bismarck was able to do 30 or 32 knots. Even with the Bismarck damaged and leaking oil, it was still able to make 27 or 28 knots, or roughly about 30 miles per hour, which is just so fast if you think about it. For a ship that's 50,000 tons, all armoured, leaking oil, it's still able to make 30 miles per hour. It is just an amazing feat. But this is what the Bismarck was doing, and it was way faster than any of the other Royal Navy. But the Royal Navy had another force which was nearby, which was the ship Rodney, and the ship Rodney had good fire capability, but it wasn't big enough to fight the Bismarck. But it did track down where the Bismarck was and make its way there. But the Bismarck was able to slip past and go in radio silence, and radio silence basically means that when a ship is radio silent, other ships can't detect the radio signals. So this is why a ship would go radio silent, so it could basically sail through the seas in a stealth mode and not be able to be detected. And with the Bismarck making its way towards France to safety, this is where the Bismarck would make a huge mistake. The Bismarck, instead of remaining radio silent until it reached France, it sent a radio message to France asking for help or somewhat protection from this Royal Navy contingent that was closing in on them, asking for support. And the Royal Navy were able to pick up these signals and triangulate exactly roughly where the Bismarck was. And this is where a group of destroyers were nearby, and they were commanded and ordered to get as close as you can to the Bismarck and to track it and to find out whereabouts it is, because the rest of the Royal Navy were blind and they couldn't see the Bismarck because it was too fast and it had made its way through the Atlantic and on its way to France. So these destroyers, and one of these destroyers was a Polish destroyer, and this is an amazing story about this Polish destroyer. Absolute legends. There was these destroyers, I think there was about 12 or 13 destroyers. These ships wouldn't have been able to do anything to the Bismarck, wouldn't have been able to cause any damage whatsoever, but the orders were to track the Bismarck and to torture it, make sure the crew cannot sleep. This ship would probably roughly take 4 or 5 days to reach France. So within these 4 or 5 days, we need to track this ship and to make sure that it cannot sleep. So all these destroyers that were making its way to the Bismarck, their plan was to drop as much torpedoes as possible to try and hit the Bismarck or slow it down or damage it in any shape or form. And this is where the Polish destroyer Prion, it's called, also in Polish means thunderbolt. That the Thunderbolt, what a name, that the Prion charged the Bismarck by herself.
We found the Bismarck. Fall back and initiate torpedo maneuvers.
Captain, the Piron is heading towards the Bismarck at full speed. What shall we do?
What? Break radio silence. Tell them to turn this instant.
They're not replying, sir.
Damn it. Break away and may God help their souls.
This ship sailed directly in line with the Bismarck, and the Bismarck opened fire on this tiny ship. And the Bismarck would almost score hits on this destroyer, missing the Prion by 20 yards. That is about 18 meters or 60 feet or so. This is how close that these shots were landing, close to the Prion. But what the Prion was doing was firing all its guns, firing every gun it had, every torpedo it had. Some say that the crew were even out with their pistols, firing with their pistols and sidearms and machine guns at the Bismarck, and they weren't going to be able to do any damage. But what the Polish destroyer did do,
Was? Pole?
I am Polish, and this is the best way you control a ship. This is the ultimate troll tactic, that they trolled or trolling this ship, because, as I said earlier, Germany had invaded Poland first in 1939. Germany had actually made an alliance with Russia at the time. Russia and Germany actually made an alliance to both invade Poland. So this is why Russia are also dirty during the war. But the Polish would message "I am a Pole," and this was the best way to illustrate the message to the German ship that they are here to fight. And it was only until orders were given to the captain of the Prion to pull back, but the Prion wanted to stay and fight, but it was running out of oil or gas. It was running low on fuel, and it decided to pull back then, but it fought the Bismarck for 1 hour, 60 minutes. Can you imagine? This is like a featherweight boxer trying to fight a heavyweight, trying to fight someone like Anthony Joshua, a little tiny featherweight trying to fight a heavyweight. It just wouldn't be a match. But the Polish destroyer decided to fight, and I'm sure the Germans majorly respected this little ship. But this is what the Royal Navy wanted. They wanted the Bismarck, not the rest. But when the Prion would back off, this is when the Bismarck would be lost again. The Prion was able to give coordinates of where its last engagement was, but the Bismarck was way too fast and still sailing towards France. So this is where Leonard B. Smith would come into play, and his squadron would get the call saying, okay, you guys need to take off and fly out into the Atlantic Ocean at these last coordinates and possibly spot the Bismarck, this big huge battleship that's steaming at full steam heading towards France. If you guys can spot it, please let us know. If you come into contact and give us the coordinates, tell us where the hell this Bismarck is. And this is where Leonard B. Smith would take off from Loch Erne in his Catalina flying boat and take off outside of Loch Erne. Would be the Donegal corridor, and this is where Ireland actually allowed these boats to take off and fly through the Donegal corridor, because Ireland was neutral during this war, but Ireland did allow these boats to fly over their area. And that's also a complicated history into the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which are within the United Kingdom. This is a complicated history. Nonetheless, this would be possibly one of the most crucial parts to play that our little country would have in the sinking the most famous battleship in World War II. That this Catalina flying boat, Leonard B. Smith, was at the controls flying out the Atlantic Ocean. He was issued coordinates by the British Naval that this is the last area which was spotted, so fly over this area, and if you see anything, radio us immediately. So Leonard Smith, this American who was on board the Catalina boat, a part of the RAF squadron, was flying over the Atlantic Ocean when he looked down outside his cockpit and he seen oil down in the bottom of the ocean, a big oil slick, and he was like, what the hell's that? And his co-pilot said, I think that's oil. It looks like a rainbow, because what they could see was down in the water like a rainbow effect because of this oil was lying on the water top, that it would look like a big huge rainbow. And Leonard B. Smith said, right, okay, I see it, I'm going to fly closer, So he descended. He was roughly around about 25,000 feet, 20,000 feet up, and he decided to start to lower his altitude and get down closer. And as he broke out of the clouds were very, very heavy and patchy, these clouds. And as he broke out of this cloud line, he could see this huge big ship, and he was like, is that one of ours? Is that one of our ships? And the guy, his co-pilot, was like, I don't think so. And Leonard Smith said, okay, I'm going to fly closer. I'm going to get as close as I can. And if this ship shoots at us, it's probably an enemy ship. So Leonard B. Smith flew closer and closer and closer, and the Bismarck looked up. And the Bismarck could see this tiny little plane flying overhead, and the Bismarck opened up with all its guns. All its guns opened fire on this little plane. And this is when Leonard B. Smith knew, right, okay, this is definitely the Bismarck. This has got to be the Bismarck. And this is when Leonard Smith gave the coordinates, the exact coordinates of his location of where he's seen the Bismarck. And he said he received so much gunfire that his plane was vibrating and shaking with the explosions which were happening inside the air, and he would elevate and get as high as he can to try and avoid this gunfire. And he radioed in to the Admiralty, into the naval, that he had spotted the Bismarck. The British had a huge naval fleet down south near Gibraltar, round about Spain in the Mediterranean, called Force H. And Force H had an aircraft carrier called the Ark Royal, and huge big warships called Repulse and Renown and Rodney. These huge big ships were able to sail from Gibraltar up into the Atlantic Ocean and try and meet and intercept the Bismarck. And this is when Leonard B. Smith's coordinates would help out tremendously. And when these coordinates were issued out to the rest of the fleet, exactly where the Bismarck was by Leonard Smith's coordinates, a British ship called the Sheffield had also made its way full steam ahead to try and catch up with the Bismarck, but it still not being fast enough to catch up, but it was still on its tail. And HMS Ark Royal of Force H had the same flying torpedo boats called Swordfish, and these Swordfish made an attack on the Bismarck, but they attacked the wrong ship because, as I said, the Sheffield was trying to catch up, and these planes had launched an attack against their own boat by mistake, and they launched all their torpedoes, but thankfully divine intervention, some sort of divine guidance, that these torpedoes were faulty and they actually didn't impact or make any damage on the Sheffield. But when these planes returned back, when the planes had returned back to their boat, did you guys attack the Bismarck? And they said yes. The commander said, wait a minute, that wasn't the Bismarck, that's the coordinates of the Sheffield. You guys attacked the Sheffield. And the commander lifted the phone to Sheffield and to see if they were okay. And the Sheffield answered the phone and they were like, hello. And the commander of Ark Royal on the aircraft carrier said, are you guys okay? And he was like, yes, we're okay. And the captain said, our torpedoes attacked you. You're not sinking, you're not damaged. And they were like, no, we're fine. Right, okay. Them torpedoes are faulty. Okay, bye. And hung up. They loaded up torpedoes that were going to work, and they made a second attack, and they said, do not attack one of our own ships. And the Sheffield that was attacked, they said that they couldn't believe when they looked out on deck and they seen all these planes coming their way, and they were like, oh my god, they're going to attack us. And they were waving, saying, don't stop. But these boats these people on these boats were way too small for these pilots to be able to see them. So this is when the torpedoes were loaded onto the planes and a second attack was made on the Bismarck. So with this second attack underway, 15 swordfish planes took off from the deck of HMS Ark Royal with the correct torpedoes this time, and they made an attack on both sides, the port and starboard side, both sides of the Bismarck, and they would fly in at such a low angle that the Bismarck, its massive AA guns, weren't able to get low enough to try and stop this attack. But anyway, the Bismarck still fired all its guns to try and prevent these planes from attacking, and the torpedoes, these bombers, these swordfish planes would all launch, and out of the 15 torpedoes that were launched, only 3 would strike. 1 would do very little damage in midship, 1 would do a bit more damage, but 1 torpedo, just 1, hit the steering column or the rudder of the ship, and this is where the damage would be done on the Bismarck, which would cause her downfall, and the Bismarck would be struck. And the Bismarck tried to avoid these torpedo attacks by turning the port and turning left basically, and when the torpedo struck the rudder, because the Bismarck was turning left, the rudder was stuck to left. The captain of the Bismarck, Captain Lutyens, did a damage control check and could see that the damage could not be repaired at sea. Captain Lutyens would make a radio call to Germany saying, ship unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last shell, long live the Fuhrer, and would hang up his call. And this is where the British knew that the Bismarck was stuck and trapped, and all of the Royal Navy were able to circle and to close that gap where the Bismarck was. The Royal Navy were full aware that the Bismarck, although she was damaged, was still a very dangerous ship and could cause any ship in the Royal Navy to explode, just like HMS Hood. So they decided to stay back, stay a bit more back, and to fire as much guns as possible. But during this time, on May the 26th, all destroyers, which were little smaller boats, made a bunch of torpedo attacks, and to try and do as much damage as possible safely, while HMS Rodney and these other ships, Repulse, or much larger guns, were able to fire full broadsides miles and miles away from the Bismarck. And with the Bismarck not being able to move correctly, the Bismarck wasn't able to do as much manoeuvres as what the Royal Navy was able to do. So this was basically a turkey shoot. That this was a very simple exercise to sink the Bismarck, and every single ship of the Royal Navy, to say 67 ships were involved in this chase. 67 were around the Bismarck on its own, just pummeling this ship as much as possible. So with the Royal Navy closing this gap, you had Rodney, King George, Repulse, Sheffield, Renown. All these ships were able to fire all their guns, and the Bismarck began to take hits after hits after hits. And this is where they say the captain, Captain Lutyens, was killed during this action. This is when the Bismarck was taking so much damage that the people on the Bismarck knew that it was over, that this fight was over, and the order was given to abandon ship. And on the British ship HMS Rodney, the captain would say that the Bismarck went down fighting and did not fly a colour of surrender, and it sank with its colour still flying, and it went down fighting to the very, very end. And this is where many of the survivors began to be picked up from the water, and some of the ships that were trying to lift up some of the German survivors, one of the ships had heard a call of a U-boat in the area, and this is when the boats began to leave, and many of the men from the Bismarck would ultimately die in the water because of one of the U-boats. Now, I don't know if the U-boat was there to attack or the U-boat was there to actually help the survivors, but this U-boat was enough of a threat for the British to leave the area. And with the Bismarck sinking, this is where scuttle charges were placed on board the Bismarck, and the Bismarck was scuttled by her own crew. And scuttle charges are these huge big explosives that are placed within the deck, within inside the ship, to blow up so the ship could actually sink faster rather than being destroyed by the Royal Navy. So the Bismarck actually went down under her own hand rather than the hands of her enemy. And many of the crews of the Royal Navy said it was the most bravest last stand that they had ever seen, and that it was something that the German Navy should be very proud of their sailors for staying to the last and fighting the way they did. And this is something that is still spoken about today, and it is something to respect and admire, that these men fought to the very, very last. They fought every single tooth and nail to the end. So what happened to Leonard Smith after the Bismarck was sunk? Well, word began to travel around the military that the Bismarck had been sank and victory had been won. The HMS Hood had been lost. Many sailors were killed. 114 sailors survived the Bismarck, and word started to travel around the military that this flying boat, this Catalina flying boat, had actually spotted the Bismarck and was able to locate the position for this torpedo attack to occur. And people started to ask, what was the name of this guy? And people started to say this name, Leonard Smith. And the British papers announced his name, and the Americans realised that that was one of their pilots. Wait a minute, this is an American pilot here. So the Americans lifted the phone to the British and said, we need that pilot back, because you need to remember, Germany did not declare war on America until the 11th of December 1941, and this was May 1941. So Germany did not know that an American was involved in the sinking. So Leonard Smith returned to Loch Erne, where he would continue his career until he got a phone call from the American government saying that he needs to return to America as soon as possible. And this is when he arrived in America, and he would be awarded in secret the Flying Distinguished Cross from the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And when he was awarded this medal, they didn't want to publicise that he was involved in the sinking of the Bismarck, obviously to not upset the American people, knowing that Germany could possibly attack America. But Leonard Smith was awarded this cross, but it wasn't declared what it was for. But he was awarded the Flying Distinguished Cross, very, very important medal for distinguished bravery and heroism in combat. And yes, he was in combat because the Bismarck opened fire on him, and he possibly could have been killed. But what happened to Leonard B. Smith was that he was actually sent to Hawaii in December, and you probably know what's going to happen here. In Hawaii, he was ordered to help train pilots in navigating in coordinated search patterns. He was just to help train young pilots, because he was obviously a Flying Distinguished Cross awardee. So his job that day on December 1941 was to fly from Hawaii to Midway, and they were on their way, and all of a sudden a phone call arrived through the radio transmission. A radio transmission came in that America was being attacked in Hawaii, and this was Pearl Harbor. And this man was involved in possibly two of the most important events in World War II, that sinking of the Bismarck, the Terror of the Seas. He was involved in that, and then he was on a mission on his way to Midway when Pearl Harbor, Japan, the Empire of Japan, attacked, a surprise attack on the entire American Navy. Now, there is a conspiracy, big conspiracy, that America was well aware of this attack coming in, but many historians say that America just didn't really consider it a threat. But it is a very interesting theory that America was attacked by Japan and they were well aware of it. But neither here nor there, the Japanese did attack Pearl Harbor and sink many boats, and this would lead America into World War II. And this was on the 7th of December, or December the 7th, 1941. And this is when America would come into the war, and Hitler would declare war on America, on the US, on the 11th of December, only 4 days later. So this is just a crazy decision from Adolf Hitler, but this goes to show you that the Axis powers, Hitler, was in agreement with Japan attacking America. But this was the downfall of Nazi Germany, that declaring war on America was the last thing that you should do. But America didn't get boots on the ground until the 6th of June 1944. So this goes to show you that Leonard B. Smith had an amazing job to play in World War II, that from 1941 until 1944 he was the first American involved in a naval victory. And Leonard B. Smith would remain in the Pacific Theatre for the entire war, and after World War II he continued his service and actually would fight in the Korean War and the early stages of the Vietnam War. So this guy done it all, and if you look at his Wikipedia page, there's no picture of him. There isn't even a picture of this guy, just his name, a bit of information. And it is sad, there's very little information about this absolute legend. And after serving early in the Vietnam, he would eventually retire, and he would continue working as a real estate businessman. So he was working in the real estate and property, in the property market. And can you just imagine you being some other guy who's working in the business world, and there's some man that you're working with who was involved in sinking the Bismarck, who was there in Pearl Harbor that day, and he was also fighting in Korea and Vietnam. And Richard Nixon, the future president, he actually worked alongside with him in the naval department. And Richard Nixon would go on to say that he was the most hard-working man and the most conscientious individual that he had ever met, and one of the best officers. And he would retire from the Navy as captain in the early stages of Vietnam in 1962, and he would eventually continue to live in Washington until his later years, and would pass away in 2006. And just an amazing individual, amazing man with an amazing story. Just a great, that this little plane flying from Ireland was involved in one of the biggest events in World War II, sinking the Bismarck. So with the Bismarck sank, Germany would never send out another boat or another battleship into the Atlantic Ocean again. And the Bismarck had a sister ship called the Tirpitz, and this ship did not see any action, instead basically import the whole war, and didn't risk losing another ship like that. So it just goes to show you that this action did prevent Germany from establishing dominance within the Atlantic Ocean and trying to stop the merchants that were being sent over from the United States into Europe to help supply the war effort. So this is something that was very crucial and prominent within World War II, that just this pilot, Leonard B. Smith, from his flight from Loch Erne, was able to exactly pinpoint the location of where the Bismarck was, and to his ultimate sinking. And this is something that I do love telling this story to people, and it is an amazing story that this is all World War II history and people's testimonies, and that's basically the entire story of the Bismarck and what happened, and the terror of the seas. His guns have gone silent at last, and I really do like telling the story, and I'm gonna do more types of stories like this. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening to this video, and there's going to be much more like it. And if there's anything that you would like to hear, or any details that I did miss, anything that got wrong, please let me know down in the comments. This is only like my third or fourth video doing in this type of format, so please forgive me, and I'm just learning as I go here. So just I really appreciate you being here, being on board, and just thank you so much for watching. And that's all I've got for today. So may the road rise to meet you and the wind be always at your back. Thank you very much. Gia Lat. God bless. Thank you very much.